Welcome to KnotWork Storytelling. This is the show where we untangle our myths and reweave our stories, one age-old tale at a time. I'm your host and lead storyteller, Marisa Gowdy. I'm a myth worker, a story healer, a coach for writers and creative entrepreneurs, and the author of The Sovereignty Knot, A Woman's Way to Freedom, Power, Love, and Magic. If you love what you hear and want to support the show, I'd be so grateful if you'd become a paid subscriber on Substack. In my newsletter, Myth is Medicine, you'll receive bonus content related to the stories on the show and deep dives into how mythology and folklore can help heal the individual and the collective in the present moment and beyond. There's a link in the show notes to follow Myth is Medicine on Substack, or visit mythismedicine.substack.com. Season 5, Episode 6, The Inheritance of the Not Chosen People. A story of Cessair by Sandy Dunlop. Before we dive into this week's story and conversation, I wanted to be sure you know about my summer offerings. On Thursday, August 1st, we'll gather for a 3-hour retreat called Harvest, an online Lunasa retreat. Writers and creatives from around the world will gather for this event, and I hope that you'll join us. As you may know, Lunasa is the first harvest of the Celtic year. There's a rich mythology connected with this celebration. During our time together, I'll tell you the story of the goddess Taltu. It's a story about service, sacrifice, and celebration. It's a deeply important story for anyone who is seeking to do deep creative work and share it with the world. We'll work with this myth and ask it to help us reflect on our year's creative journey to that point. And because it's only the first harvest and there's so much more growing to do, we'll be setting goals and dreaming into the stories you might tell and ideas you might craft in the months to come. In this retreat, you'll have time to write and connect with a beautiful community of myth-minded folks who are on the quest to use these ancient stories to make sense of our modern world. Harvest, an online Lunasa retreat for writers and creatives, is open to everyone. Or it could be your introduction to our global writing community, the Writer's Knot. When you enroll in a 5-month membership in the Writer's Knot, from August through December of 2024, you can attend the Lunasa Writing Retreat for free. Also, one last announcement before we get into the story. If you've been wishing you could join the Writer's Knot in the past, but have never been able to make the time work, I wanted to make sure that you knew. In addition to our traditional noon Eastern on Wednesday gatherings, I'll be starting an additional group that will meet at 7 p.m. Eastern on Mondays. You can find all the details on my website, marisagowdy.com/events. Our guest, Sandy Dunlop, has run Bard Mythologies with his wife, Ellen, for 25 years. He sees himself as a cultural mythographer with an understanding of the way cultural myths are used and abused by the powerful. He ran a master's in global branding, as well as a consultancy specializing in helping global brands discover their archetypal and mythical roots. On bardmythologies.com, you can learn more about the Bard Summer School, and you'll also find a rich collection of Irish myths and global myths that take you deep into the time-honored oral storytelling tradition.
Myth is there. It's both used and abused. And the problem is, as Marshall McLuhan said, we can't see the water. Mm-hmm. So the urgent task, and this is why the work you're doing is so important, the urgent task is to reflect on the myths we live by.
I am so excited to have Sandy here on the podcast today. As is our way at KnotWork Storytelling, first we're going to ask the story to speak for itself, and then we'll sit together and talk about all the ways that it still resonates and matters. So Sandy, will you tell us a story?
Sure. The story that I'm going to tell today is of the first person to arrive in Ireland and the first people to arrive in Ireland, according to the mythic history of Ireland. And it is an extraordinary mythic moment of huge, iconic, historic consequence. And it is the story of Cessair. and her arrival in Ireland with 50 women, the mothers of the world, they're called, and 3 men. And her story begins with a remarkable journey. And it begins in a place called Merrow. And when I first came across it, I had no idea where or what Merrow was. And when I looked it up, I found it was a place in northern Sudan, one of the oldest civilizations of the world, a place of great pyramids and an established trade network with the rest of the world. And these pyramids were the great Nubian pyramids of the 3rd and 4th century BCE. And the kings buried there were the Kushite kings, the Kushite monarchs. And it's important, this place of origin of this great story, this great journey, because for many it's seen as the center of civilization, where civilization and where humanity began, really. So the place is significant in the northern Sudan. It's meant to be an island on the great Nile River. And Cessair sets off, and she travels down the Nile or up the Nile, whichever way you look at it. And she arrives in Egypt, the place of writing and moral insight and of philosophy and the great pyramids and the great Alexandrian library of Ptolemy in the 3rd century BCE. And one of the things that Cessair would have experienced as she traveled on this journey is that she would have surely heard the great creation myths and the great myths of the cultures she passed through. Now, this isn't in the text, but it's of the mythic imagination. And she would have heard of Isis and Osiris, and how the goddess Isis's husband is dismembered by his jealous brother Seth into 14 pieces. And Isis's quest as a healer is to assemble her dismembered husband's body. And she's successful with virtually every part except the penis. So she fashioned something out of that, and we have a reconstruction of the body of the god Osiris. And then she travels to Babylon and Assyria, the place of numbers and mathematics and great feats of engineering. And here she would have heard the great Babylonian myth of Tiamat and Apsu, and how the goddess Tiamat and her consort Apsu give birth to some sons who make a lot of noise, and as is the way, the parents are annoyed with it, and Apsu decides to wipe them out. But they get to hear of it, manage to get in first, and Apsu's killed. Now, what happens, not surprisingly, is the wife is angry. And here we have a motif whereby the angry woman creates monsters and dragons, and the only one who can deal with this monstrous angry woman is the great strong man Marduk. And Marduk fires an arrow into Tiamat and kills her. And it's out of the dismembered body of the goddess Tiamat that the world is created. And already she would have learnt something, which is, in some cultures, it's the dismembered god. But in Babylon, it's the dismembered goddess. And it's from the dismembered goddess that the strong man creates the world. And here we have the beginning of an important myth of great significance, in that it is the birth of the myth of the strong man. He who will rescue you at a time of chaos, and he demands complete obedience. That is his condition of taking on the great goddess. And maybe we also see the shift from matriarchal goddess cultures to more patriarchal city cultures. And she heads down to the Hebrew tribes. And here she would have experienced some of their mythology. But we also learn that she is actually the granddaughter of Noah, who will be familiar to many, because when we have this vengeful and angry God Yahweh, who's dealing with a world of sinners, he has appointed Noah to create the ark. And 2 by 2, all the animals of the world trot on board, and essentially few of the non-sinners get on board too. But for the rest of the humanity, this vengeful God will wipe them out in a flood. And unfortunately, Cessair doesn't make the cut. And so what we have is the granddaughter of the great Noah, who says to her, "You are consorting with thieves and vagabonds, and I'm having none of it, and you're not getting on the ark." And so what we can know from that is that means she is going to die. So here we have a huge mythic moment of huge consequence, because what we know is that she's likely to be terrified. And what happens, as we know from modern neuroscience and the autonomic nervous system, is that people in these stages often freeze, or they supplicate themselves to the strong man, freezing and fawning. But Cessair's having none of this. And that's why it's a huge moment. And what she does is she takes herself a new idol, and she tells her companions to worship it. And these companions include her father Bith and her brother Laura. And what she says is, "I'm going to sunder you from the God of Noah." That's what the text says. And what she does is she builds 3 arks, and she sets off under instruction of what some see as a priest of Geb, to seek a land free from humanity, to start again. And that's significant. It's a moment of the creative use of rejection, of dealing with not chosenness, of dealing with being thrown out of your tribe, being thrown out of your family, which in the ancient world meant a certain death. And that's what's so significant. This formidable woman, Cessair, says and does, and she builds 3 arks, and her journey carries on in these 3 arks, and she collects these 50 women, and they're called the mothers of the world. Of the world. She collects the mothers of the world. And she travels through Greece with its incredible mythology and its gods. This is no monotheism. The Greeks had gods and goddesses who were governed by and govern over the world of emotion. Now, Greece also had a remarkable philosophy and philosophical thought developing, and perhaps a switch, depending on what time in the mythic history we place this journey, of the philosopher's argument with myth. Not because it didn't work, but because it did work. The philosophers didn't like myth because myth works so well. And what they were worried about was that it had too powerful a hold on the Greek people. And her journey carries on, and she encounters the Celts with their rituals of kingship, their belief in the abundant universe, and an incredible link between humanity and the land. And it's this lady with her 50 women that arrives on the shores of Bantry Bay, Dunlop. The scholars argue as to exactly where it is, but it's down there, somewhere in the kingdom where Cork meets Kerry. And for the first time, the land of Ireland is occupied with one of the world's not chosen people. This lady is the not chosen. And in a way, that is the story of the Irish. They typically were the people who came from somewhere else, escaping oppression and hardship and not chosenness. Because this great iconic moment of her being thrown off the ark is the iconic moment of dealing with pain, with crisis, with failure, with rejection, and with not chosenness. But she's been on a journey that makes the Odyssey look like a trip round a duck pond. It's 10 times as long as the journey of the great Odysseus through the Aegean Sea round Greece to Ithaca from Troy. Cessair's journey is 10 times as long. And when she arrives in Ireland, she brings a remarkable wisdom, which you only get when you travel to other cultures. Because as Marshall McLuhan says, the one thing about which the fish knows absolutely nothing is water. And what he's talking about is culture. That thing that is all around us, and yet we cannot apprehend it because it's so familiar we take it for granted. But by God, Cessair knew the water she was swimming in because she'd swum in so many cultural waters and so many mythological waters. Given that she's landing on a virgin island, she's bringing, in a way, a blank canvas on which to paint a mythology, to create her own creation myth. And you have to ask and deduce from her behavior, in a world hardwired, a Western world hardwired by the myth of the strong man, that at a time of crisis, because what myth speaks to is that time where chaos moves to order. And these creation myths are incredibly important. Anytime the world moves from order to chaos again, people go back to them to learn what to do and how to behave as their world is falling apart. And the time when the underlying structures of culture are threatened, people look at their foundational stories. And one of the mythical challenges of modernity is just how hardwired the myth of the strong man is. That at a time when you feel your culture is falling apart, you revert to a Marduk or a Noah or a Yahweh or any one of the tyrants and dictators and autocrats that seem to be populating so much of the world at the moment. I, judging from her behavior, do not think that Cessair had a lot of interest in the dismemberment of a goddess by a strong man to create the world, or when your world is falling apart. It's unthinkable that she would have had any time for a resort to a strong man, because after all, one of her foundational experiences is of her strong man, morally good grandfather throwing her off the ark, condemning her to a certain death. But Noah didn't account for this formidable creative response, this extraordinary woman who has populated the mythic imagination of Ireland for 1,500 years. And this is the first story of the first person in the mythic history of Ireland. They acted as if this was their origin myth. And so she arrives in Ireland with a remarkable wisdom, the first wisdom of the Irish, a synchronic wisdom, which means she's seen all the mythologies and creation myths of the world and has the opportunity to decide and enact what is to be the creation myth of the not chosen people of the world. And one of the sad things about the Cessair story is 50 women and 3 men is imbalanced. And particularly when Bith dies and Laura dies and Fintan can't handle what he's faced with and heads off to a cave. So what we learn there perhaps is the importance of equality for something that's sustainable. And Fintan, through shape-shifting, lives for 5,500 years. So he brings another, he's the partner of Cessair. And Cessair dies actually of a broken heart because the love of her life, Fintan, has disappeared because he can't handle looking after what men might think is the ultimate male fantasy until they're faced with it. But he lives for 5,500 years. So he brings the other 2 great wisdoms, the wisdom of diachronic wisdom of having seen it all. And he also brings the wisdom of what you get from shape-shifting and becoming a hawk and a salmon. So what we've had here is the story of a remarkable woman and her journey, 10 times longer than the Odyssey, that is the foundation of the mythic history of the not chosen people, the people who came from somewhere else and created a few extraordinary mythic moments. What to deal when you're thrown off the ark and have an opportunity to start again.
Oh, and Sandy, the way you offer us the imaginal realm's backstory is so powerful. And I've never been so grateful to be an unchosen person as in listening to your story. And also feeling that pain that you just speak to so eloquently of, oh, we all know what it is to not be chosen. And that just is such a beautiful sort of poetic illustration of what you said throughout the story is myth works. And what you're doing here and what you offer for us in this sweeping tale gives us so much insight into the now, especially the parts we don't want to think about, like that great strong man and all of the ways in which he's embodied in our world right now. So thank you so much for taking us on this such a sweeping journey.
Well, thank you. Well, I like any opportunity to tell the story because it wasn't really much part of a lot of the texts. Lady Gregory doesn't mention Cessair, and many, even if they cover the Book of Invasions, they don't tend to cover this lady.
Right.
And you could also see why the monks mightn't have really wanted her mentioned, because if they had another agenda, the notion of the powerful feminine.
Mothers of the world kind of uproot the entire monastic vision they were seeming to be trying to put together there.
But a fair dues to them, they did write these stories down.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So I sort of want to start at a place in that idea that as much as this is this powerful creation myth, and as much as we in these modern days tend to get, whether it's because of our DNA testing or whether it's because we're in a wonderful way really aware of culture and lineage and being sure that we're not co-opting indigenous people's ways of being, for example, we've really put a lot of emphasis around, knowing where you're from and honoring that. But I find it so remarkable that this is a creation story, and these were the mothers of the world, but none of their physical descendants lived on. And that's always been sort of a fascinating paradox for me in this story. And I wonder if it's, in a way, partially explains why it's been a story that's hard to work with for folks in terms of, she was the great foremother of Ireland, and what she left behind was her story, not her descendants.
Yeah, well, the next crowd that came, the Partholonians, they were all wiped out too.
Right.
And then the Nemedians, they were all wiped out.
Yeah.
But in a way, it's kind of illustrative of an approach to death, which is we're all going to die, but maybe the story doesn't die. So she's been a source of inspirations, but it also highlights something that's really hardwired in the mythological cycle, is the inherent fragility of humanity's place in the world.
Yes.
But whether it's floods or plagues or our own stupidity with civil wars, don't make the assumption that things are fixed. There's an inherent fragility about these heroes and heroines and gods and goddesses' place in the world. And I think that is something you can take. And certainly one of the critical things you could take out of the Cessair story is the importance of balance. And I think that's absolutely hardwired into the Cessair story. It might be a nice idea, 50 women, but if there aren't men around, you're in trouble.
Right.
50 into 1 doesn't work. So even out of the failure of the story and the sadness and the broken heart, you've kind of got, by implication, something that's an absolutely recurrent leitmotif in the Irish myths is the importance of balance.
Yes.
And equality.
Yeah.
And the primacy of the local, the primacy of the story. There's a whole worldview and mythology and ideology and philosophy that you can deduce from this compendium of stories that is the Irish myths. And what I would say is that they are the mythologies, first of all, very different from the strongman that people like Jordan Peterson, he ends up with, his book, Maps of Meaning. He is brilliant in his analysis of myth, but what he then says is the exemplary myth is the Enuma Elish. And I think, well, you haven't met Cessair, Jordan, because she certainly didn't think the Enuma Elish and the God of the Old Testament was an exemplary myth.
And the Enuma Elish is the Tiamat story? Help our listeners.
Yeah,
with which,
okay.
Okay.
The Enuma Elish is the story of Tiamat and Marduk.
Okay.
And Jordan Peterson, in his Maps of Meaning, looks at all this stuff, and he knows the importance. What he says at the start of the book is something we cannot see protects us from something we do not understand. and what we cannot see is culture. So he's like Marshall McLuhan. We can't see culture.
Right.
And what we do not understand is the structures of culture which hold our world together. And the structure of culture is the compendium of myths. And he says we will do anything to stop them falling apart. But the hard wiring of Western culture as a result of the Enuma Elish, the Tiamat and Marduk, and then how that then influences the Old Testament. But I see the Old Testament's completely different from the New. It's almost like a completely different mythology. Because the Old Testament, full of a vengeful God who give the chosen people their promised land, and anyone who gets in the way, God seems to mandate genocide. Gideonites. What's happening in Palestine?
Right.
Mythologically mandated genocide.
So what you seem to really be speaking to here too is the way in which is the interpretation of myth and the way of really putting all of your eggs in one particular reading's basket. And when you're looking at the Tiamat and Marduk story next to Cessair's story, and these two completely different ways to respond to crisis, to things coming undone. Yeah.
That's exactly right. And the point about myth is it speaks to trauma and crisis. It speaks to that time that Jordan Peterson describes as the structure of culture falling apart. You go back to your creation myths. And what Jordan's suggesting is going back to this exemplary myth of Tiamat and Apsu.
Right.
Now, my view is, and it's not in the text, but it's an exercise of the mythic imagination. My interpretation of Cessair, having seen it and observed her behavior, she would say to Jordan, no, sir, that is precisely the mythological operating system that's caused us so much trouble. This hierarchical, vengeful, punitive God who's set in a context of sinful humanity, a complete put down, with stories like Moses of, if you're chosen, I'll lead you to the promised land, and if the Gideonites get in the way, I mandate that you can slaughter men, women, and children. It's in the Bible, it's in the Old Testament. It's absolutely hardwired.
Right. And this story, which is not in the Old Testament, in which the woman's response is neither, as you described it, neither to freeze nor fawn, but to instead say, in this moment of crisis, when I've essentially been condemned to death, I shall build myself not one ark, but 3. And she seems a little less concerned about the camels and the donkeys and much more concerned about her 49 closest female friends and her dad and her brother, to really set sail, as you said, in that greater way than the Odyssey, into an entirely new story and an entirely new land that hasn't yet had its stories told.
Spot on, Marisa. You've got it. Well, it's the creative use of pain, crisis, and failure, but it's a mythology for the not chosen people of the world, basically most of us, and a mythology for the people from somewhere else, also most of us.
Yes.
And it's an alternative to saying you're going through pain at the moment, it's not your fault. The dragon is the Jews, or the dragon is the elite, or the dragon is terrorist, or the dragon is knowledge. And it's not your fault, and I will make you great again by building walls to keep out the people that I have dehumanized in the story and othered them.
Yeah.
That is the toxic effect of strongman mythology. That's how it works narratively. And it works with myth. Myth is abused by the tyrants and dictators.
Yes.
And I put together 4 videos on how Donald Trump is absolutely brilliant at use of some of the foundational cultural myths of America. And I tongue-in-cheek suggest that the classics department in Harvard should offer him an honorary doctorate in the application of 20th century classical studies and storytelling. He did it to present himself as a strong man. The one thing he will never do is present himself as not strong.
Right. Even when he's convicted of 34 felonies. But you know what I'm learning about you, Sandy, in this case is that beware if ever Sandy Dunlop calls you brilliant, because you've now labeled both Donald Trump and Jordan Peterson with that word. And ordinarily one might think that was a title to strive for. But I feel as if brilliant in your case has a very interesting shadow attached to it in terms of how one can be brilliant at working a myth and really be using it in ways that are deeply damaging and hurtful and perpetuate so many of these cycles of destruction and dominance that are way too common.
You've got it, Marisa. Myth is there. It's both used and abused. And the problem is, as Marshall McLuhan said, we can't see the water. So the urgent task, and this is why the work you're doing is so important, the urgent task is to reflect on the myths we live by. And that's essentially what the Bard school or Bard Mythologies does. And what it reverts to is a mythic method, which is a timeless method, which is because we cannot see the water that we're swimming around in, we need a counter environment. And that's what the bardic function is. It gives you a world that's a funny mixture of both familiar and unfamiliar, that makes no pretense to truth. You add up the number of days that Cessair would have built the ark, and you say, well, she couldn't have done that, and then use that to dismiss the story. You say, well, work with your mythic imagination. It would have taken the whole time that you said was the journey to simply build the ark. Well, what are you going to do? So it doesn't make any pretense to truth. The irony is that in the listening to an oral story, this is why it's spot on for you to begin with the story. People listen to it. They're not interested in a history lesson, is what we learn from anthropology, who study oral. What they're interested in is, what does this tell me? What does this story tell me about today? So it enables you to reflect on the cultural water that you're swimming around in, and it enables you to see what you cannot see. That's why the gift of the divine to the Irish High King Bran by the sea god, Manannán mac Lir, when he's enchanted away by a woman giving him a silver branch, an otherworldly woman. And what she gives him is not tablets of stone and scaring the bejesus out of him, as they say in Ireland. She gives him a new way of seeing, silver branch perception. And that's why on the website we have an image of Manannán mac Lir coming in his chariot out of the sea to encounter the High King, and gives him a new way of seeing, silver branch perception. And that's what Bard Mythologies is about. It's probably what you're about too, Marisa. Is silver branch perception, using all these ancient cultural myths enable you to see deeply, to see beneath the surface, to see what's you're unaware of, to see what you're unconscious of. Now, the point is that you then do not want a priestly caste telling you the meaning of the story. So we get out of the way. I don't know what you're going to take on Cessair. I mean, in a way, I gave my own particular take, so I didn't follow my own principles. But normally we just tell the story and let people deduce, well, first of all, what's this story telling me about? And then how does it relate to the modern world? Because in the anthropologists like Goody and studied oral societies, people are listening to it as a way of understanding what's going on. And the storyteller would pick a myth that he felt was speaking to them at the time. So the oral storytelling tradition is a form of collective self-reflection, collective therapy, collective way of dealing with trauma, collective way of healing. And then having got to the quiet space and given yourself 15 minutes or half an hour to listen to a story, you know what to do. The community knows what to do. It doesn't need a priest, doesn't need a god, doesn't need a morality. They know what they need to do in the complexity. They come to quiet.
Yeah.
Come to quiet.
Yeah.
That's what they call it in the Alexander technique. Come to quiet. Listen to a story and then talk about it with no priest in the way.
I haven't yet made my way to the summer school with you, but I intend to sometime soon, I pray. But it's interesting to think about that sense of listening to the story and then working in community, which I do with some of my own groups that I lead. But I'm not sure if you know, I told my own story of Cessair in the last season of the show. And I certainly didn't have the global cultural vision that you brought to this version. I instead must have been the mood I was in at a certain time. My story was much more really about how righteously pissed off she was at Fintan for kind of taking off on her. And, I did my best to tell the rest, the arrival and what it was to land at Bantry Bay. But I think that's another element here, that as we're talking so much about these big cultural movements inside these stories, as you take us across these thousands of years of history and throughout these great civilizations, and knowing too that there's parts of the story that hit us in that core, as you're really highlighting the sense of being one of the unchosen and how that feels, whether you're sitting at recess when you're 7 years old and you don't get chosen for the team, or whether it's to have your heart broken by a beloved. And just the ways in which we can choose to meet these stories at the personal and at the vastly cultural. And I feel like in part of what you're saying, and certainly in the core of what my greatest intention with this work is to really be able to blend the two of those with a real fluidity and fluency, because that seems to be so much of what, at least my understanding of what these stories always want to offer us. And it seems like it's that personal work, but it's also that community work that allows the both to really emerge.
Yeah, myth is multivalent or polysemic. Basically, it works on every level. And in the 20th century, having the Enlightenment made myth a dirty word. But what happened in the 20th century was there was a re-engagement with myth. And one of the most popular was obviously the depth psychologists of Freud and Jung. And for them, the myth is the structure and dynamics of the psyche. Right. And you can see it in their focus on dream and myth. I mean, Freud, I struggle with some of his interpretations. It's almost like he was a theory looking for an explanation, or a theory looking for a problem, and found it in the Oedipal thing.
Right.
So, but I mean, the point there is that it works at a personal level. So your elaboration and elucidation, which is also dealing with not chosen.
Right.
Because not only is Noah not choosing Cessair, her lover, in his actions, it was a rejection. So but he had a broken heart too, probably, but we don't really know. So you fill in the gap. So it works on that level, but then it works on a, whatever level you want to take it, cultural, political, national, cosmic. The myth can work on any level.
Right. Sandy, thank you so much for sharing such a beautiful, sweeping story that touches the cultural, the personal, and everything in between. I'm just so grateful for your time today. Thank you.
I'm not sure it's beautiful. It's sad as well.
Well, there's beauty in the sadness. I think that ability to follow you along and follow you through the history and take us into the spots we don't want to look at, that's beautiful to me.
Yeah, thank you. All the best.
All the best. Thank you. Thank you for tuning in to the KnotWork Storytelling Podcast. Please subscribe and review the show on your favorite podcast platform, and do share this episode with other lovers of myth and story. By the way, everyone is a lover of myth and story, even if they've forgotten. Creating this show is a labor of love, and your support will help me continue to craft and share stories through this season and beyond. Please consider becoming a subscriber to my paid newsletter, Myth is Medicine. You'll find it on Substack, and that's where all my newest writing and occasional bonus podcasts can be found. You can learn more about my writing, my book, our online creative community, The Writer's Knot, as well as how to work with me as a writing coach over at marisagowdy.com. Gratefully, I live, write, work, and record this podcast on the ancestral lands of the Munsee Lenape tribe, whose name means original people.